Hello everybody, my name is Anej Korsika. I'm a member of Institute for Labor Studies and coordinator for international relations at the Initiative for Democratic Socialism, a political party that is part of United Left coalition that now has 6 members of parliament out of 90 that are in Slovenian parliament. As you know, Slovenia is a bit of a specific case regarding the Eastern European region, and this specificity already begins in the former regime, in the regime of Yugoslavia. So I would like to devote a few minutes to the period of Yugoslavia, and then we will continue to the situation today, what are the perspectives, and how nowadays self-management as a serious political economic idea could be implemented. Well, as most of you probably know, after the Second World War in 1948, there was the famous Tito-Stalin split. Basically, Tito was kicked out of Inform Bureau, and there is an anecdote about this. Stalin invited Tito to Bucharest, and Tito was like, I was thinking whether should I go to Bucharest or I should do something good for people. So he decided to do something good for the people. And of course, this first couple of years after 48, indeed the Yugoslavian regime was trying to be more Soviet than Soviets themselves. It was a very harsh time. But then in 50s, gradually the idea of socialist self-management, socialist worker self-management became ripe, developed. So as you all know, this was a specific type, a specific developmental path towards socialism, much different than the Soviet statal type. The basic idea was that enterprises were, in a way, elementary units of economy. In these enterprises, workers supposedly, at least nominally, had all the decisive power, the power to decide the development of the enterprise. And this is the system that, with some changes, lasted until the breakup of Yugoslavia. Well, of course, in principle, this was a good idea, but as Che Guevara already noticed when he himself visited Yugoslavia, he remarked that inside these enterprises, the relations of solidarity do indeed exist. But the problem is that in between these enterprises, the relations of competition, of getting the raw materials for as cheap of price as possible. So these classical market relations prevailed. And this is indeed a problem that later on escalated. As you know, because of this specificity that we mentioned in the beginning of the split between Tito and Stalin, Yugoslavia, not only in economic but also in the political, in the sense of international politics, chose its own way, its own path. And one of the great elements of this policy was the so-called non-aligned movement, which gave Yugoslavia a very, so to say, privileged position to be, together with other countries like India, Egypt and others, at the very head of this group of nations that were still liberating themselves of the colonial yoke, and in this sense Yugoslavia was quite popular both in West and in East, so it got loans from both sides, and this was of course good for the development of Yugoslavia. And this money could be used for the development of the completely shattered and destroyed economy after the war. And despite this, the problem of unemployment was still a very acute problem in Yugoslavia. And one of the external ways of solving this problem, so to say, was the principle of so-called guest workers, in German Gastarbeiter. And in the period between 61 and 71, these guest workers, the number of them that left Yugoslavia to work in Germany, has risen from 16,000 to 400,000. So there was a huge influx of Yugoslavian workers that went to West Germany, of course, to build mainly as construction workers to build stuff there. And of course these workers were sending a part of their wage back to their families. So this was not something that one could ignore. It was quite an important part of the Yugoslavia's development. But coming back to the fact that Yugoslavia was also quite heavily dependent on the loans, especially from the West, from the International Monetary Fund. This fact actually aggravated the situation throughout the 80s, because after the oil crisis that Yugoslavia was very hit by, IMF and other institutions started giving conditions, political conditions, in order to extend these loans. And of course, as we all know, this was the traditional trio of liberalization, privatization, deregulation. And here we come back to the fact, the observation that I mentioned beforehand of Che Guevara, that inside the firms there was a kind of solidarity, but between them there was still very classic market competition. All of these elements and these trends just got worse towards the end of the 80s. The external debt of Yugoslavia rose to $22 billion. The inflation was 187%. And already at the time, the Yugoslav government was basically forced to implement austerity measures. And something that our comrade from the Institute of Labor Studies analyzed under the name of wage mentality became ever more prevalent. Because the situation of common worker was getting ever worse in the sense of just everyday commodities and everything. Workers became primarily concerned about their situation, and therefore the amount of their wages. So that's the wage mentality. These economic differences, disparities between republics of Yugoslavia were translated by certain groups into nationalist antagonisms that, as you all know, later on escalated into a very severe and bloody war. But already before the breakup of Yugoslavia, there were huge, enormous economic differences, for example, between the most developed republic, Slovenia, and the least developed republic at the time, still region with a special status, Kosovo. These were huge disparities. For example, I think Kosovo had less than 40% of GDP per capita of that of Slovenia. And the usual mantra was of the more developed republics like Slovenia and Croatia that the less developed republics are exploiting us, that through fiscal transfers they're taking away our money. And in the south, in these less developed republics, there was also a kind of resentment that only the more developed republics are benefiting from the project of Yugoslavia as such. So, as I said, there were certain political groups that started capitalizing on these differences, nationalist groups that later on were led by Slobodan Milošević in Serbia, Franjo Tudjman in Croatia, etc., etc. To not go in too much detail, I will just now quickly jump to the post-disintegration situation in Slovenia. The important thing is that there were massive workers' strikes throughout the 1991, 1992, 93. Really, quantitatively and qualitatively speaking, there were many workers' strikes. This was also a time of wild privatization. According to some estimates, 1 billion euro of formerly state assets was privatized, more or less illegally, or the law simply did not exist to regulate this. And here the great specificity of Slovenia comes in. Instead of this wild privatization, this, in other words, shock doctrine being continued, the policy of certificates was implemented. Basically, each worker became a shareholder. To not go into too much detail, this prolonged the privatization. It did not prevent it, but it meant that the privatization was much more gradual. But already at the break of the century, of the millennia actually, the capital side was already in the advantage. So the most of the workers already sold their stakes in the companies, and the privatization as such was even sped up when we entered the European Union in 2004, when we got the euro currency in 2007, and 2007 and 2008 was also a period of intensive, at least thrice, of managerial buyouts, of managers trying to get credits in order to buy out, to privatize the companies. And as we all know, the crisis came, this house of cards shattered, and in all this period, workers' self-management was not really prominent. It was not an idea that would be widely advocated. It was something very much symbolized by the former system, something, so to say, polluted by the experience of Yugoslavia. And now with our party being in the parliament, it is the first socialist party after the disintegration of Yugoslavia, and we are openly advocating for workers' cooperatives, co-management, self-management, various ideas. These are our ideas, but unfortunately the government as such is not really interested and is trying to finish the long privatization process. Just a few days ago, they actually sold the Slovenian Telecom, the greatest telecommunications operator, and our comrades yesterday had a massive protest in Ljubljana, the capital of Slovenia, and of course we will fight this privatization, but unfortunately till now we only have 6 out of 90 MPs, so this is why we are trying to build our project grassroots as well. We perceive the parliament only as one of many fields of struggle. Thank you.